There we go. Excellent. So very briefly about the Gardner Institute, for those who may be unfamiliar with us, the Gardner Institute is 25 years old, and we're geographically located in Western North Carolina, although our staff, including myself, are distributed across the country. And we focus on supporting institutions as they strive to increase student persistence and graduation. So we do lots of different things at the Gardner Institute. We'll be talking about curricular analytics today, but at the end of the session, you'll have a chance to see and hear more about the wealth of things that we offer at the Gardner Institute, both short-term and sort of longer-term commitment. And before I get into the opportunity that we're going to discuss, I want to let my colleagues introduce themselves. I'm joined today by several of my colleagues who work with me in the curricular analytics community, and then some of my other Gardner Institute colleagues. I'm going to let first Brandon and Rob introduce themselves. They're my colleagues working with me in the CAC, as we refer to it. Brandon and
Thanks,
Rob.
Steph. Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks all of you for joining us this afternoon. You're going to learn that we are pretty passionate about curricular structures. And so if you got questions as we go through this, feel free to add things into the chat. At the end, we'll do a little Q&A. But I'm Brandon Smith. I'm an associate vice president at the Gardner Institute. I have the great privilege of getting to work on the curricular analytics community with Steph and Rob, and also on our transformation work, chief academic officer, communities of practice, and a few other things. So just really glad to be with you all today and to dig into this thing that we think is pretty cool and pretty transformational. So I'll pass the mic to Rob.
Goodness, I love following that. I am Rob Rodier. I'm the Associate VP of Technology, Informatics, and Data Security. I also love the curricular analytics community work. Can't wait to share more with you, and I'll hand it back over to Steph.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm also joined today by my colleagues Katie Locke and Brittany Connor. And Katie will be presenting a little bit at the end. And as Brandon mentioned, we would love to have your questions throughout the session. We want this to be interactive. So please do post questions throughout and we'll pause and answer them. Anything that's on your mind is more important than what we plan to say today. So we want to hear from you all. And also our question and answer period today that we'll have throughout and at the end. Please don't please don't feel like that's the only time you can ask questions. Feel free even afterwards to stay in touch with us and ask questions. We're happy to answer them at any time. As Rob mentioned in the chat, we do have a few questions that have come in through the registration forms, and Rob is going to help us make sure that we get to those adequately. So first of all, we want to talk a bit about the why. So the opportunity that we have with the curricular analytics community. I know that all of you are here for a reason. I won't ask you to divulge that right now, but you certainly can if you want to. The why that compels Rob and Brandon and I is unique, but we also have some common things that really drive us to do this sort of work and also drive us even beyond this to think about curricular analytics and improvement science, which are the foundation of what we're going to be describing with the curricular analytics community, thinking about that and using that toward institutional transformation. So creating clear pathways and helping transform our institutions. The piece that we have on the screen in front of you is from the Chronicle. It was published in 2020, and it documents some of the foundation of the work that we're doing in the curricular analytics community. So some of the early work that led to the version of the curricular analytics community that we're talking about today. So you can read that if you have time. But I just want to point out that it's there and it helps you to kind of understand what institutions have done and what led them to work with us and to work with the curricular visualization tools. And the answer to the question in the title, is your degree program too complicated? The short answer is yes. All of our degree programs are too complicated, not intentionally, but it happens. And especially when we think about not just the pathways for students who start off at our institutions, but those who transfer to our institutions as well. So those are problems of practice that we tackle in the curricular analytics community. So you're probably here because you also want to know what to expect, like what will this experience be like and what will it lead me to be able to do? So the curricular analytics community is designed in a very unique way, I think, because we bring together curricular visualization tools, as I just mentioned, and improvement science tools and methodology to create a process that you all will walk through and essentially become sort of a train the trainer sort of model where you'll have an opportunity to actually use the tools, you'll go through the process with us, and then you'll be able to employ that as you bring others at your institution on board. So as you're thinking about, getting faculty involved in this work, more faculty maybe than you would start off with, maybe start with a core group, and then you want to broaden it because you're interested in, for example, maybe using this for, curricular program revision or, curricular review. This is a way for you to be able to do that. So through this process, you would be trained in these tools and you would have access and you would have a process that you could take back to your colleagues. There's 7 synchronous meetings, and then we have a virtual community of practice that follows, and that goes through the duration of the academic year. And we're re-envisioning those meetings now. We're thinking a little bit different of a bit of a different structure, but we will have those synchronous meetings and then some sort of a community practice component. We offer ongoing support throughout the process, technical and practice-based support. We're here for you throughout, so it's not just during those synchronous meetings, but at other times when you may want to meet with us in one-off sessions with your team. We're happy to do that. And then, of course, access to our platform that we use with the curricular visualization tools and the learning management system that we use for the improvement science parts of the process. And just very briefly, these are the topics and the focus for the curricular analytics community. On the right-hand side, there's a visualization that shows you the steps that we walk through together. So we actually visualize the curricular pathways. So we create visualizations using programs of study to begin with, and Brandon will talk more about those in just a moment. And then we identify problems of practice and we begin to analyze parts of the system that are contributing to this. We identify drivers, we create a plan, and then hopefully in the course of the year, not just the seven-week period, but the year, you would begin to implement some changes and you would study those. Improvement science is action-based. It's practitioner researcher approach. So we want you to be actively seeking to answer questions and make adjustments throughout the work that we're doing together and getting feedback. That's part of why we continue to meet with each other so we can learn from and with each other as well. So you can see what follows after you begin to upload the data, the programs of study and create visualizations. We identify the problem, we visualize the system, we work on driver diagrams to identify the drivers for change, and then we create plan, do, study, act plans and cycles, and then we present those to each other. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Brandon.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks so much. So I'm just going to pause for a moment before we jump into the tool further to make sure there aren't any questions. I don't think anything's come through on chat, but feel free to stop us at any point because what I would say is this process embraces complexity and sort of demystifies things that have maybe remained obscure, or maybe not visible. We know that students have to traverse the curriculum, right? They have to traverse these pathways. However, we don't always visualize the connections, specifically the prerequisite and co-requisite relationships in courses in a way that allows us to see them, let alone analyze them. Usually the only way we know something's a prereq is because it's in the catalog or it's locked up in a grid of some kind, if we're really lucky. But because we don't visualize these things, it's very difficult to analyze them, even harder to maybe optimize them. And that's where curricular analytics really comes in, is it gives you a framework to do that that's quantitative in nature, that we then supplement a lot of qualitative and also some additional quantitative data if you have access to those data, to understand how the design of your courses in a program of study might be creating bottlenecks or challenges for students. So that's really what this is all about. And I'll actually jump into the platform in a minute and show you all the tool, because that picture here on the right, this is actually one of the maps, but it's not a static map. the tool set is actually very dynamic in nature and lets you do what if scenarios. So once you have your initial map built, which typically takes maybe 60 minutes or so for the first map, um, then you can go in and start to make changes on the fly in a very user-friendly interface. So our approach, as Steph mentioned, improvement science based, really interested in the causes associated with undesired outcomes. We're going to invite your teams to really go through and say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And sometimes there's more than one. But frequently, what we find is that the problem we identify, such as, let's say, low retention in a program, that's not actually the problem. That's the output of many different causes, including things like these curricular structures or pedagogy or practice or the way we advise students or all manner of things. And this process really invites your teams to dig into all those variables and try to design for student success and maybe even do some redesign as part of that. We're trying to embrace the complexity and make it visual as opposed to skipping over things that might be impacting that undesired outcome. And that at its heart is what improvement science is really all about, inspired by Ed Deming's work and the healthcare industry and others. Improvement science is really the education focused version of this work. Um, so when we say curricular analytics, and when you read about curricular analytics and the literature that's out there, we're talking about investigating individual programs of study, right? So a major, and and doing so using these four quantitative elements, right? So I'll talk through those and then I'll hop into the platform and show you very briefly. But the first is a blocking factor. So if each of these circles in fact, I'll do it on the platform, and that way you can just see it there because I know this well enough to just show you the demo site. So hopefully you all are seeing the demo site now. So the first metric is the blocking factor. If each of these courses is, or if each of these circles is a course, we're basically saying how many courses does this course block? So you'll notice I went to this English course. It blocks one class, and you can see it, that advanced writing course. The delay factor is the sum of the terms on the longest chain. In this case, really simple, right? Two terms, you see them there, term one and term four. The complexity is the sum of those two factors. The blocking factor, how many courses are we blocking? And the delay factor, how many terms are we stretching across on this chain, on the longest chain associated with this course? The reason that delay factor matters is because we frequently see chains that are 6, 7, 8 terms for a 4-year program or for a 4-year program of study. And when you see really long chains, it means that the student cannot have a misstep. They can't miss a course. They can't earn a D, failure, withdrawal, or incomplete without adding a term. And most of our students, when they add a term, they add a full term of coursework. And that's where that credit accumulation comes from. So these are all parts of the process. Um, that's a real thing right there. In this case, we're looking at this EDUC 100 course. It blocks 18 classes, delay factor of 9, because we've got multiple courses in certain terms. And again, the overall complexity is the sum of those two. Now, to get centrality, you've got to find a course that has both roads in and roads out. That one's an extreme example. I'm going to pick one that's a little less complex. So with centrality here, what we're talking about is that you can access additional coursework once that course is complete. Usually with your courses of highest centrality, these are the courses after which students tend to finish a program of study. The challenge here is that, as you can see in this example, they don't usually occur in the first or second term, which is where we traditionally see what we sometimes refer to as gateway courses. And so these are really important courses that may not be getting the attention related to student success or the support related to student success that we traditionally give some of those gateway courses. So again, when you're in this space, as you can see, you can click on courses. Additionally, you can create copies, variations of the coursework and rename those. And then you can go in and click that edit curriculum button and literally go in and move courses around between different terms. to do what if scenarios to see about trying to address some of this complexity. And there are lots of different ways to do it. But what we see sometimes is that it's about changing some prerequisite relationships between courses, but a lot of times it's about other practices related to advising or student support that come out through this process. So I could talk a lot longer about the tools and about what's here, but that gives you an idea of what curricular complexity really is, at least here in the work that we do. Another piece that we think is worth telling you about is a gateway variant. So we know that these gateway courses that block lots of other courses are critical. They happen early in students' term, and early on in this work, we started wondering, could we use this tool set to map one course across multiple majors or across multiple majors. And so in doing that, we really can demonstrate the primacy of those gateway courses when they block, for instance, in that one, it's 63 courses for that general biology. We have one example with an algebra class that blocks, well over 100 courses. And what this allows us to do is go to that terminal node on a chain and work our way backwards for conversations about learning outcomes, student support, and how we might address helping more students get through these courses that are clearly limiting progression across multiple majors. So it's a pretty exciting additional use case that we offer, and a lot of our institutions are leaning into that this year. This has been I think we've had this about a year and a half or so at this point as a new piece. And Steph, I'm trying to remember, is this still me or is this you? Still me? Okay.
It is you, but I'm happy to do it if you would like me
No,
to.
no, I don't mind. So with these are just a couple of examples because traditionally in the literature, we only see examples from STEM, right? That we've actually published a little bit here at the Gardner Institute on other examples, including some of these history. But we wanted to let you know that this works for high complexity programs of study, lower complexity programs of study. And you can still see improvement in student success. Traditionally, when folks want to lean into this work, they're leaning into programs that have outputs, right? Or problems of practice like low retention, low graduation rates, extended time to graduation. You can see that with that delay factor or excess credit accumulation. If you got a program of study with any of those four output metrics or KPIs, it's ripe for curricular complexity analysis. So we've had a 2D, 3D art program go through, and they removed a bunch of prereqs that really weren't prereqs anymore. They revised a lot of the connections across the curriculum, and they did all this in very short order and presented it at their state level, and really revamped their program using this. We see a lot of schools invite their either creating new programs or revamping programs to use these tools because it just gives you a new lens to do that. Engineering's a classic example. We see a lot of schools trying to increase completion rates in their engineering programs. This example from one of our institutions, they recognized that they needed to change how they were advising students through their program of study. So they changed their advising tools. They developed some new student readiness tools for some of the courses that they offered. And then in addition to that, they realized that they had students taking courses across three different campuses in the same term, and that was actually part of why they were having a problem related to students not showing up to class. And that just came out in that qualitative causal factor combination. So they rectified that. The bio example, I'll move quickly again, removing prereqs, changing advising processes and sequencing, and then also they implemented some new academic support within their major in some of those critical courses. And we see that a lot, that we suddenly recognize we've got a bottleneck here and we don't have any tutors or we don't have any supplemental instruction for this class. And then finally, the campus-wide example, we've seen a number of institutions either work to right size a program or go in and really sit down and try to understand how they can combine programs, think through the timing of capstones, and really work with faculty to reimagine those programs or to make this part of annual or in some cases 5-year assessment processes. So these are just a couple of examples. but they highlight a lot of the primary drivers that we see come up over and over again. So again, to recap here, um, we see institutions using this to try to advance or improve student completion, improve transfer student success. We haven't really talked about that in this case, but you can create a map that's a program of study from a sending and receiving institution, and you'll actually see that there are differences in curricular complexity and where it lies for students who are first time full-time at the four-year institution and those who transfer in. It's a really powerful tool for us to understand how our transfer students might be experiencing our curriculum differently. And then finally, the gateway example that I covered earlier. All right, I think I'm going to pass it to Steph.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brandon. Let's pause here to see if there are any questions, and we would be happy to answer them. I know that's a lot of information, and I know also it can be overwhelming to see some of the visualization. It's exciting, but at the same time, it may be a little bit overwhelming. So if you have a question, you can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we're happy to recognize you. Let you ask it in real time. Well, as you all are
I think,
continuing to think, oh, Rob, there was a
yeah,
question.
well,
Go ahead.
I just think maybe we can discuss a little bit more, like we've shown the tool, sort of the
Yeah.
upfront piece that we cover, is in the primer, but then there's a lot of what Brandon discussed in that last set of slides are the discussions that we have in a lot of the community pieces.
Mhm,
So there's we spend a lot of time going through questions to help you look at this
mhm,
from a systems point of view to see how that system, your organization has created the visualization that's there.
mhm.
So it's not like it doesn't just appear out of air and like all of a sudden you know why it's complex. There's a workbook that's sort of involved, and we help the institutions go through that, or the teams from the institution.
Oh, that's a good point, Rob. So that's also what differentiates this from, just going online and creating your own visualizations. We pair the two together so that way you have a process, something to like work through as you're learning these things about your curricula and
Yep.
as the
There was a
faculty are learning.
there was a question earlier, well, in one of the registrations, and it was, can this program assist with how our program curriculum can help retain and attract students? And I think
Mhm,
there's the visualization piece where you can see some of that. We call it spaghetti and meatballs, and I hate to throw that lingo out, but the visualization that Brandon showed can show some of that complexity, with the way those yellow and blue lines start just going all over the place. Um, but also there's that piece where we help direct you through a conversation to look at, what are some of the factors that help created this in the first place. And I think that's where, if you're doing a program review or you're looking at student success, it's those pieces there that help inform sort of the discussions around what you're looking at, whether it be a blocking factor or the overall complexity. Um, that's that's sort of the meat of what you can get into here, um, because you can overwhelm somebody with that big picture, and then you sort of dive in, and you got to pull it apart. And there are different visualizations there, whether it's the Ishikawa fishbone diagram to do a causal analysis of how do you get to where you are. Um, but I'll turn it back to you, Steph. But that was one of the questions about program curriculum and how this can help them look at retaining and attracting more students.
And Rob, it looks like your
Oh, look at
additions have prompted a question from
that.
Tamara. How
Okay.
has it been used with program reviews and reaccreditation? So we've had a number of institutions have used the tool with their program review process. So changes to existing programs of study, proposals for new majors or minors and programs of study. So right now we have an institution that's doing that. They've put all of their programs through this process. They've created the maps and have engaged all of the faculty in the work that we're doing in the current cohort of the curricular analytics community. So there are a few different ways to approach it, but we've seen institutions adopt this. So one way is, to create the maps, the visualizations for all of the existing programs. So that way faculty are aware of what the baseline is. We know what's happening here. And then as they're proposing changes, they will create new visualizations. So as Brandon showed you, the tool actually lets you do some what if scenarios. So that way, if we moved a course around, or if we changed a prerequisite, or if we embedded some knowledge earlier on in the student's program of study, how that would sort of change the landscape. And that's what many institutions are doing as they're using this, for their program review. And similarly with reaffirmation of accreditation, we've had a few institutions that have used this mostly for their disciplinary reaffirmation of accreditation, and specifically in engineering. So to show how students are flowing through, especially students, for example, that are calc ready or those who are not.
Mhm.
And you can create different versions of the visualization so that way you can show the differences. And it's very compelling. I mean, it's compelling for the faculty, but it's also, compelling for changes that you might want to make. And I know that it's been very effective, for some of the folks who have used this in that process. Brandon, Rob, you have any additions?
I think you covered it, Steph. What we've found is that this offers not just the visualizations, but a process to take teams through really unpacking why we want to make changes, right? So looking at evidence, multiple forms of evidence, and developing that theory of change to better support students, and then having a way to keep track of how that change is actually having an impact. And that sort of framework and level of support and focus, I think, has been really helpful for a lot of our institutions.
All right, good question. Keep them coming, please. So our process, as you probably can tell, is very dynamic. You are actively involved and engaged. We're not just disseminating information or tools, for you to use later on, but actually going through this process with the intent that you would be able to bring this back, to your colleagues and do something with what you're learning and with the tools too that we've given you. So then you might be wondering who should participate in this exciting experience. And, we think that the bench potentially can be very deep. So we see that faculty are key, obviously, to this because they are the folks who are predominantly, creating these curricular pathways by, designing these majors, these programs of study, and they're the ones teaching the courses. So they also know some of the history of prerequisites and co-requisites, and they understand the ins and outs and how things have evolved. So faculty are very important partners in this work. Also, academic affairs administrators and deans, department chairs, associate deans, anyone who has an influence on or some involvement in the curricula could definitely be useful and on the team, because we need to have people who also have some leadership and can help to kind of bring things along too as changes are being proposed. Institutional research staff can be helpful, even though the data that you are providing, that you're using, is largely publicly available information. So you're looking at uploading programs of study, and you're using that to create the visualizations. But as Brandon mentioned earlier, you can also layer on DFWI rates. So grades of D's, F's, withdrawals, and completes can be incorporated into this work. And there are other forms of data, quantitative and qualitative, that you can add, and some of those can come from your institutional research staff. Retention specialists, student affairs, student success staff, those who are involved in reaffirmation of accreditation, and students. We've had a number of students. We have some now who have been very helpful in this work. Some of them have helped to input and create the visualizations, but there's so many different ways that you can call on students and involve them as partners in this process too. And I see that there's a question from Kelly in the chat. So let's answer the question. Have you used this at a system level with pilot institutions? And she said, I can imagine it would assist with conversations and mapping for things like transfer pathways, pre-program requirements, industry licensure toward credentials. So we have used this with not an entire system, but with parts of systems. We've tried to have even larger groups, but we have used this with parts of systems. We have institutions in the state of California, 2- and 4-year institutions, and in Washington, 2- and 4-year institutions that we've engaged in this work. And then we've also done some work in Texas as well with some of the licensure. So someone who is in a central office who works with the different campuses. So there are a lot of different examples of institutions that we worked with, and we have, written up papers that have documented the work, particularly what we did in the state of California with the 2- to 4-year institution related work. We made some presentations and have published a little bit along those lines. Brandon and Rob, any additions?
It was really fun, and that
Yeah.
there's a huge, if you've got institutions that are the hardest part is getting the faculty from multiple institutions to sit down at a table and
Yes.
look at maps that allow them to see the crossover from their institutions. But when they do, there is major learning to be had.
Yeah.
And these faculty are the experts. In fact, in many cases, especially with the gateway courses, we found in California that the faculty were teaching at multiple institutions, and they shared with us all kinds of challenges associated with this sort of lack of discussion that they were having across institutions.
Right.
And so it's a great opportunity if you can bring a handful of institutions or an entire system along. The sort of potential for improving systems and sharing information is truly significant.
Mm, it is. In and of itself, the 2-year pathways, when you map them, are generally not complex at all. There's no ideal complexity score, by the way,
Mhm.
which can be a little bit frustrating sometimes to institutions in this process. They want to know what's acceptable or not acceptable. But, we like to sort of reframe that, as we're working through this, we're not working toward an ideal, but you have to identify, what an acceptable score might be for your institution and for your various programs. But when you look at the 2-year programs in and of themselves, they're not complex. But then when you look at the entire transfer pathway from the sending and receiving institutions, mapping those together, it's amazing what happens to transfer students potentially. You have complexity walls that they hit immediately after transfer, and then you have places within the curricula where they're learning something and they're not using it for 9 semesters. The transfer of knowledge can also be vast. The chains are long. So those are all things that have to be considered, as we're working with transfer students. And we have a short chapter that's coming out in a book, and we'll actually be talking about it during part of our author series in May, that is specific to the transfer work that we've been doing and the research related to that. All right, there's another question. Which case studies would you recommend we read for an example of system use? We'll be happy to share some information with you. We'll share some from our California related work and then this transfer piece as well once it's available. Right. I think I'm
Before
going to
we
turn
get
it
to
over.
this,
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
there's a question about somebody wanted to learn about methods to align the core course competencies. And I
Mhm.
think that question that they put into their registration is sort of embedded in what your response just a minute ago, Steph. It's the conversations and looking at the long chain of
Right.
the courses, looking at that and having those discussions. That's where you look at your competencies. There are other places where you
Yeah.
can embed those inside the live system that Brandon was showing us earlier. You can add those comments about this course handles these sets of competencies and see how that tracks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. I think I'm going to hand it over to Katie now to talk more about the logistics.
Thanks, Steph. So, of course, everybody wants to know how to apply and what the fees are. So this gives you a little bit of information. Our application system is about 4 questions, very brief. And really what we're trying to find out with the application is, are your expectations for the curricular analytics community, do they match up with what is going to happen? So we want to make sure that we're going to meet your needs. You can see here that we start this year on March 27th, and the synchronous meetings will go through May 6th, and then the community of practice will continue asynchronously. Well, there'll be some, synchronously with recordings that you can access asynchronously throughout the academic year. And the fees listed here are based on your undergraduate enrollment and as reported to College Navigator. And I do know we have a couple of people on the call from systems. So if you would like to discuss with us, we can have a conversation about how we would price that out for y'all. So I can reach out to you if you'd like and set up a time to have a conversation about that. I don't believe we have anybody from Transformation Schools. If you are, of course, there's no fees associated with this. You've already covered that. So a little bit more about what we offer. We offer a whole plethora, a smorgasbord of options focused on student success. And if you are not sure if the CAC is right, what is exactly the best way for you to get started working with the Gardner Institute, we would be very happy to have a conversation with you around that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we do have 4 in-person events happening this year. We have a 2-day workshop on the Gateway course experience. We have a 2-day workshop on the transfer experience. And then in October, we are having, those are in, the Gateway course is March, transfer is May. And then in October, we're having a graduate student success conference, and then followed up by our symposium, which is our sort of annual conference. It kind of covers all of the different types of work we do. So any questions, please feel free to reach out to info@gardnerinstitute.org. And I will, if I can't answer your question, I will find the right person who can. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And with that, I think we'll be happy to answer questions. And if you all would prefer, we can stop the recording so you can ask questions in real time, or we can hang around if you'd like to ask questions one-on-one with us. We'll be happy to do that too.
Yeah, happy to answer questions. Hop back into the platform if you like, however,
Yep.
you'd like to spend this time, we want to be at your disposal. And maybe, Katie, is it okay if we go ahead and stop the recording?